Silicon Wafers Daily is a roundup of news over the last 1 to 2 days, with a particular focus on the resurgence of authoritarian regimes in the 21st century, great power competition, democracy on the defensive, the Russian imperial project, and how Ukraine is leading the fight back for values and freedom. In this short video format, I hope to bring some light to dark times. We'll be publishing these, ideally, 5 times a week. Today is September 22nd, 2025. Over the past 2 days, we've seen sharp escalations in the Russia-Ukraine war, new moves from Moscow on arms control, and rumbles in the clash between great powers. We'll walk through what's new, what it reveals, and what it tells us about tyranny, imperial ambitions, and the long arc of global authoritarianism. Let's begin. Russia's massive drone and missile assaults, civilian terror as a strategy. On September 20th, Russian forces launched what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy called a massive coordinated attack. Over 580 drones and around 40 missiles fired overnight at 9 regions across Ukraine, including Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Chernihiv, Zaporizhzhia, Poltava, Kyiv, Odesa, Sumy and Kharkiv. That's according to Reuters. The targets were infrastructure, residential buildings, civilian manufacturing, and once again, Ukraine's energy supply. In Dnipro, for example, a cluster munition struck a multi-story residential building. At least 3 people were killed, dozens injured. Again, that's from Reuters. Ukraine responded with drone attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, oil refineries, and pumping stations in Saratov, Samara, Bashkortostan, and others, causing fires and disruptions. That's covered in the Washington Post. The attacks on both sides follow a well-worn pattern. Russia strikes civilians to spread terror and fear, while Ukraine strikes at the logistics and energy supplies that enable Russia's war machine. What we're seeing isn't merely an escalation of violence, it reflects a deliberate choice by Moscow to weaponize civilian suffering and infrastructure, the energy grid, homes, schools, as part of its war of attrition strategy. As the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, has noted, President Putin remains committed to a strategy and to a belief that Russia will be able to win a war of attrition against Ukraine. That is from the publication Understanding War. This pattern, high-volume drone and missile strikes, often indiscriminate or explicitly targeted to inflict terror, underlines what many analysts call Russian imperial revanchism, the belief that territory once held or claimed or spheres of influence must be recaptured or reasserted by force. Civilian populations are not collateral damage in this logic. They are targets and tools to exert control in this power grab by Moscow. On to the next story, NATO, airspace violations, and the edge of the wider conflict. At the same time, tensions beyond Ukraine's borders are rising. On September 21st, German Eurofighter jets were scrambled after a Russian Il-20M reconnaissance plane flew over the Baltic Sea with its transponders switched off, ignoring communication attempts. That's in The Guardian. Estonia also reported repeated airspace violations, including by Russian MiG-31s in the Gulf of Finland. Estonia called for an emergency United Nations Security Council meeting, the first time in 31 years as a member that it had done so. That's according to The Guardian. Germany is also planning for worst-case scenarios. The German military is preparing to treat up to 1,000 wounded troops per day in case of a direct conflict with Russia. That was reported in Reuters. These incidents matter not just for what they are, but for what they show, that Russia is pushing the boundaries of peacetime international order, violating airspace, deploying provocative military assets near NATO borders, seeking to test resolve. This is classic great power brinksmanship, but this time carried out by a regime that is terroristic in its character, that has no sense of limitations on its behaviour, and does not seek the favour or respect of the West, which marks a fundamental difference from the Cold War period. NATO's response is failing to deter, failing to articulate the costs for Moscow if it continues down this path, and a failure to create a hard barrier to Russia's aggression. Scrambling jets, planning for large casualty rates, These are signals of a failure of deterrence, but it also signals a subtle resignation to what's happening, an acceptance that these provocations and escalations can only go further still. There is also the arms control drama. This is a breaking story. Putin's proposal, US reactions, and of course China's role. Also this week, President Vladimir Putin offered US President Donald Trump a once-a-year extension of the New START treaty, which currently limits deployed strategic nuclear warheads to 1,550 per side and is due to expire on February 5th, 2026. That's according to Reuters. Putin frames it as a gesture in favor of non-proliferation to restart broader arms control dialogue, though he had previously tied such discussions to improvements in bilateral ties, including progress on Ukraine, where, of course, his demands continue to be maximalist and quite unreasonable for Ukraine or its allies to accept. Its real allies, let's say. That's according to Reuters. Meanwhile, the US has suggested any new agreement should include China, something that Beijing has rejected. Putin also expressed concern about US missile defense plans, particularly space-based interceptors, warning that they could upset the strategic balance. That's according to Reuters once again. Putin's proposal leaves many question marks. Is this a genuine step or a diplomatic tactic to forestall pressure over the war in Ukraine? Could it be another effort to distract and deflect, such as the Alaska summit, an effort to re-establish Moscow as a serious player on the world stage, to create the image of a peacemaker while it continues to unleash hell on Ukraine? A cynical and hollow ploy, but one which some countries will no doubt collaborate in supporting. Is Moscow trying to buy time, flatter Trump's narcissism, or once more divide Western alignment? China's role in this, of course, looms large. Its refusal to participate in a treaty, yet has asked to be included in the process and communications. This signals its own calculations in the great power competition. Remember that in earlier months, analysts observed that China officially claims to have a neutral stance toward the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but Beijing stands accused of playing a pivotal role supporting in Russia's war effort. That's according to the Atlantic Council. Morally, maintaining limits on nuclear weapons remains critical, but arms control without accountability for war crimes, civilian targeting by Russia, or without parallel pressure on revisionist powers means it loses all meaning. The extension could be useful if it's part of a broader diplomatic pressure, not a way for Moscow to pretend legitimacy while continuing its crimes, especially in Ukraine. Now we move on to global authoritarianism and China's quiet support. While China has not overtly declared itself at war, its posture regarding Russia remains deeply ambivalent, formally neutral, but with behavior that observers view as enabling Moscow. As the Atlantic Council has pointed out, China, India, and North Korea are increasingly siding with Russia in broader international forums, aligning against interventions, sanctions, or criticism. That's according to the Atlantic Council. There are also credible Ukrainian claims that Russia plans training for Chinese military personnel later in 2025 to counter Western weapons, though China's foreign ministry says it has nothing to share. That's according to uscc.gov, and we have to remember China's participation in the Zapad 2025 military exercises in Belarus as well, where they had a small but significant contingent present on the ground. This is another axis of the great power competition and of the authoritarian slide around the globe. The way autocratic regimes or hybrid autocracies increasingly coordinate amongst themselves diplomatically, economically, and crucially militarily to neutralize norms such as sovereignty, human rights, and the laws of war. Beijing's support, whether overt or tacit, strengthens Moscow, boosts its ability to finance the war, and provides diplomatic cover. Far from being a force for order, China is playing a deeply disruptive role. Is China playing both its adversaries and allies, however? From its perspective, allowing Russia to lose could reduce its leverage in Eurasia, but allowing Russia to win outright would create a more powerful Russia, potentially less dependent on China and more capable of challenging China's interests. That tension is real. Beijing is balancing it in the most cynical way. That is the view in Russia Matters. And on to Ukraine's security guarantees. Can the West deliver? Zelensky said recently that the basic document on security guarantees for Ukraine and therefore for the whole of Europe is practically ready. That's according to Buzzsprout. These guarantees are supposed to be credible, meaningful, and sustainable. A theme picked up on in Moscow's Shadows. That is a podcast written by and presented by Mark Galeotti. That is arguing that Ukraine needs assurances that deter Russia effectively, not symbolic promises. On the ground, Ukraine continues its counter-offensive operations, reporting gains around Pokrovsk and Dnipropetrovsk, while Russian forces claim territorial gains in other Donetsk villages. But many of these Russian claims are either unverified or contested. That's according to The Guardian. Security guarantees are more than just paperwork. They are the lifeline between perpetual war and a possibility of peace. But guarantees without enforcement, without boots on the ground, without planes in the air, without political will, are, to an extent, hollow. In a world where Russian doctrine bristles with revanchism, genocidal rhetoric, where norms can be bent or broken by autocrats, and where legal documents mean absolutely nothing for the current Russian regime, what matters is whether guarantees are backed by credible deterrence, military, economic, and diplomatic. The West, NATO, EU, US must decide, do they want a stable Europe grounded in legal norms, focused on wealth generation, innovation, and freedom, or do they accept a Europe where fear, coercion, increasing poverty, instability, and territorial theft are the status quo? Well, I hope this new format will be useful. We are, of course, curating these stories which have relevance to global power competition, authoritarian slide, Russia's autocracy, and Ukraine's heroic resistance. There is a lot going on, but spotting the patterns and trends in current events is important to do. Let me know in the comments what you think. Over the last 2 days, the news threads include massive drone and missile strikes in Ukraine, Russia revising nuclear treaties on its terms, China's shadow support for Russia's war, NATO's anxiety over airspace violations, and Ukraine pushing for binding security guarantees. These are not isolated items, they are chapters in a larger story of imperial revanchism, of authoritarian states evolving not just internally, but trying to reshape global rules, of democracies weighing the costs of either ignoring the threat or confronting it and taking the appropriate actions. From the moral standpoint, the stakes are clear. Either we uphold sovereignty, civilian protections, accountability, or we signal that raw power and fear win out. For Ukraine, for its people, this is existential. For the world, it is a test. Can great power competition be constrained by law, by human rights, by certain norms? Or will it devolve into unrestrained force? Might makes right. Keep watching as we update these stories weekdays, 5 days a week.